Hey guys, welcome to tonight's story. A story about the greatest high jumper of all time. A story about greatness. So tune in and get to sleep. But before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely like my content. The air in Liminar was heavy with warmth, a mixture of Caribbean sun, red earth, and the faint salt of the sea carried inland by restless winds. In this small Cuban town, life moved with a rhythm dictated by the land, by sugarcane fields, and by the spirit of people who had learned to find joy in simplicity. It was here, on October 13th, 1967, that Javier Sotomayor was born, a boy who would one day bend the laws of gravity. Javier's childhood was not one of privilege. His father worked long hours to support the family, while his mother, known in the neighborhood for her kindness, kept the household together. The Sotomayor family lived modestly, but like many Cuban families, they lived richly in community. Children roamed the dusty streets barefoot, chasing balls made of rags, climbing trees, and daring each other to impossible feats. Javier, tall and wiry even as a boy, quickly gained a reputation for his ability to jump higher and run faster than the others. It wasn't just physical ability, it was curiosity. Javier wanted to see what was possible. When he leapt over fences to retrieve lost balls, he did it with flair, sometimes clearing them in ways that seemed unnecessary but beautiful. His friends joked that he had springs in his legs. To them, it was play. To Javier, it was instinct, an expression of joy. School in Cuba was rigorous, structured not only around academics, but also around physical education. In a country that prided itself on sporting excellence, especially in baseball, boxing, and athletics, talent was noticed early. Coaches visited schools, scanning playgrounds for the spark of natural ability. One such coach, tracking the Liminar children during a physical education session, noticed the tall boy with boundless energy and a mischievous smile. Javier was just 12, but he already towered over many of his classmates. More importantly, when the children were asked to test their jumping ability, Javier cleared the bar with an ease that startled the coach. He was invited to join a local athletics program, a stepping stone into Cuba's national sports machine. At first, Javier wasn't sure what to make of it. He loved to play baseball with his friends, and athletics seemed serious, structured. But the moment he was given a proper bar to jump over, something awakened in him. Unlike the crude fences of Liminar, here was a challenge built for flight. Each jump was not just a test of muscle and bone, it was a dance with gravity. At home, his parents were supportive but cautious. They valued education and worried that sports might distract him. Yet Javier balanced his schoolwork with training, driven less by discipline than by an inner fire. If I can jump this high, he thought, maybe I can go higher. That simple idea became a private obsession. The Cuba of Javier's youth was a nation of contradictions. The revolution of 1959 had reshaped society, offering education and sports opportunities to all, but also isolating the island from much of the world. For athletes, this meant a strange duality. They were celebrated as symbols of national pride, yet they competed under immense pressure, carrying the weight of political expectations. Javier was still a boy, unaware of the burdens that would one day rest on his shoulders. For now, he just wanted to fly. By the time he was 14, Javier had already outgrown his peers physically and athletically. He stood tall, nearly 6 feet already, his long legs giving him a natural advantage. Coaches began refining his technique, teaching him about approach speed, takeoff angles, and the importance of rhythm. But what impressed them most was his fearlessness. Many young jumpers hesitate at the bar, intimidated by its silent demand. Javier attacked it as though it were daring him to fail. The high jump, unlike sprinting or throwing, is intimate. It pits the athlete against a single, thin line suspended in the air. It demands not only strength but imagination, the belief that your body can twist and turn in ways that seem unnatural. Javier's style was raw at first, more instinct than form. But he had a gift, the ability to visualize himself over the bar before he ever left the ground. Coaches noticed this mental skill and encouraged him to nurture it. See yourself in the air, one of them told him. Then go there. Outside of training, Javier remained a humble teenager. He loved music, Cuban rhythms that filled the streets at night, and often spent evenings with friends, laughing and sharing stories. Yet there was always something different about him, a quiet intensity. His friends might tease him, but they knew Javier wasn't just another tall kid from Liminar. He was destined for something larger. His first competitions came quickly. Representing his school, then his province, he traveled to nearby towns where other talented youngsters gathered. It was here he first experienced the thrill of victory and the sting of defeat. At times, nerves rattled him, and he would clip the bar at heights he cleared easily in practice. But he learned fast. By 16, he was leaping higher than most athletes years older. Scouts from Cuba's national sports schools began to take notice. One coach, José Godoy, played a pivotal role. Recognizing Javier's extraordinary potential, Godoy pushed him harder, demanding discipline and refinement. Under his guidance, Javier transitioned from a boy who could jump high to a young man who could break records. Godoy instilled in him not only technique but also belief. "You were born to fly higher than anyone else," he once told him. Those words sank deep into Javier's heart. Still, there were struggles. Training was grueling, and resources were limited. Cuba's economy was never generous to athletes outside the spotlight sports. Shoes wore out, equipment was scarce, and travel was restricted. Yet Javier never complained. He embraced adversity as part of the journey. "If I can jump in worn-out shoes," he joked once, "imagine what I can do in new ones." By the time Javier approached adulthood, whispers about his potential spread beyond Cuba. Coaches and athletes from other nations began hearing of the lanky Cuban who soared over bars with impossible ease. Within a few years, he would step onto the international stage. But even then, back in Liminar, when the sun set and the fields grew quiet, he was still Javier, the boy who couldn't stop looking at the sky and wondering how much higher he could go. By the early 1980s, Cuba had become a land of contrasts for young athletes. On one hand, the island was isolated by politics and economics. On the other, it was home to one of the most rigorous sports development systems in the world. The government saw athletic success as proof of national strength, and promising youths were given opportunities to train at specialized schools. For Javier Sotomayor, this system would become both a lifeline and a crucible. At age 15, Javier's raw ability was undeniable. He could clear heights that most seasoned jumpers struggled with. When a visiting scout watched him soar over 2 meters with barely any training, he didn't hesitate. Javier was invited to join one of Cuba's elite sports academies. For a boy from Liminar, this was a turning point. It meant leaving behind his family, his childhood friends, and the familiar streets of his hometown. But it also meant stepping onto a path that could change his life forever. The academy was located in Havana, a bustling capital full of music, history, and the ever-present pulse of revolutionary pride. For Javier, the city was overwhelming at first. Gone were the sugarcane fields and quiet nights of Liminar. Here, life was fast, competitive, and demanding. His new routine revolved around training, study, and discipline. Coaches expected perfection, and mistakes were not easily forgiven. Yet Javier thrived. The structured environment gave him something he had never truly experienced before: focus. Each day, he worked on technique, planting his foot at the perfect angle, refining his approach run, and perfecting the Fosbury flop, the back-arching style that had revolutionized high jumping a decade earlier. His body seemed built for it. His long legs generated power, his slender frame cut through the air, his natural spring carried him higher with each attempt. More importantly, he was beginning to understand the mental side of the sport. High jump was never just about clearing a bar. It was about mastering fear, controlling adrenaline, and finding rhythm. The bar was a merciless judge. At 2 meters, it looked formidable. At 2.20, it seemed impossible. But Javier learned to treat it not as an enemy, but as a challenge, something that asked, How much further can you believe in yourself? His progress was astonishing. By 17, he was not only the best jumper in his age group in Cuba, but one of the best in the world for his age. He cleared 2.33 meters in 1983, still just a teenager. To put this in perspective, the winning jump at the 1980 Olympics had been 2.36 meters. Javier wasn't far from the world's elite, and he was still growing into his body. Cuba took notice. The National Federation began grooming him as their next great track and field star. The timing was perfect. The Caribbean island had produced champions in boxing, baseball, and track events, but never had it seen a high jumper with such promise. Javier quickly became a symbol of potential greatness. His international debut came soon after. Traveling outside of Cuba was rare and complicated, but for athletes, exceptions were made. Javier competed against seasoned jumpers from Europe and the Americas. At first, the pressure rattled him. In front of large crowds, he clipped the bar at heights he easily cleared in training. He realized that greatness required not only talent, but also composure. After each setback, he returned to Havana hungrier than before, determined to master the nerves that haunted him. One of the most defining moments of his youth came during a national competition in 1984. The crowd was buzzing with anticipation, eager to see what the tall boy from Liminar could do. The bar was raised to 2.36 meters, matching the Olympic record. Javier stood at the end of the runway. The stadium hushed. He sprinted, planted, and soared. His body floated over the bar with centimeters to spare. The crowd erupted. For a brief moment, Javier Sotomayor was not just a teenager. He was a glimpse of the future. That jump didn't just win him the competition. It marked him as a phenomenon. Newspapers across Cuba hailed him as the Niño de Oro, the golden boy. Coaches whispered that he might one day break the world record. For Javier, it was surreal. He still thought of himself as a boy who loved music, who laughed with friends, who sometimes doubted himself late at night. But with each jump, the world was beginning to expect more. The next few years were filled with growth and trials. Javier's body continued to lengthen, eventually reaching 1.95 meters, 6 feet 5 inches. His height, once awkward, became an asset. He could cover the runway with fewer strides, and his long limbs gave him leverage others could only envy. But with growth came challenges. His coordination lagged behind at times, and injuries lurked. His coaches had to carefully balance training intensity with recovery, ensuring he didn't burn out before reaching his prime. In 1987, he entered the Pan American Games in Indianapolis. It was his biggest international stage yet. Surrounded by athletes from across the Americas, Javier felt the weight of expectation. The stadium was massive, the crowd electric. He faced jumpers who were older, more experienced, and hungrier for victory. Yet when it was his turn, Javier found that familiar rhythm. Run, plant, fly. He cleared 2.30 meters to win the silver medal. For Cuba, it was a proud moment. For Javier, it was proof that he belonged on the world stage. But it wasn't just medals that defined these years. It was the steady accumulation of belief. Each competition, each bar conquered, was another step towards something unimaginable. Javier began to dream bigger, not just of Olympic gold, but of heights no man had ever reached. The world record stood at 2.42 meters, set by Sweden's Patrick Sjöberg in 1987. To most, it seemed untouchable. To Javier, it was an invitation. By the end of the decade, whispers had become declarations. Javier Sotomayor was destined to be the greatest high jumper in history. His youth, once filled with games and Liminar, had transformed into a mission. He wasn't just jumping anymore. He was chasing the sky. By the late 1980s, Javier Sotomayor was no longer just a promising teenager. He was becoming a force of nature on the international high jump scene. His name was circulating in athletic circles across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Coaches, competitors, and journalists were all asking the same question. Who is this tall Cuban who keeps soaring higher than anyone else? Cuba, though small and politically isolated, had a proud sporting tradition. Olympic champions were revered like national heroes, their triumphs celebrated as victories for the entire nation. Javier, with his towering frame and boyish smile, fit perfectly into this mold. He embodied both the discipline of Cuba's rigorous sports academies and the joy of a young man doing what he loved most, flying. In 1988, at just 20 years old, Javier made headlines at the Central American and Caribbean Championships. He jumped 2.40 meters, a height that sent shockwaves through the athletics world. Only two men in history had ever jumped higher. Suddenly, the world record, once considered untouchable, no longer looked safe. Patrick Sjoberg's 2.42 meters, set just a year earlier, loomed as the final summit. And people began to wonder if the boy from Liminar might be the one to scale it. But Javier's journey wasn't without its complications. 1988 was also the year of the Seoul Olympics. For any athlete, it was the stage to cement their legacy. Yet, due to Cuba's boycott of the Games, aligning with North Korea in political solidarity, Javier was denied the chance to compete. It was a crushing blow. While other athletes battled under the Olympic flame, Javier trained in Havana, leaping over bars with no cameras, no medals, and no glory. It was painful, he admitted years later. I was ready. I could have won. Still, if anything, the missed Olympics fueled his hunger. He returned to competition with a vengeance. At a meet in Salamanca, Spain, in 1988, he stunned the world by breaking the world record, not once, but twice in a single day. First, he cleared 2.43 meters, setting a new benchmark. Then, minutes later, he went even higher, 2.44 meters. The crowd erupted, and Javier, usually so composed, let his emotions show. He pumped his fists, embraced his coaches, and waved to the fans. In one afternoon, he had rewritten history. At just 20, he was now the best high jumper the world had ever seen. But Javier wasn't satisfied. He knew records were fragile, always vulnerable to the next great athlete. He wanted more. He wanted to create a standard so high, so unreachable, that it would stand for generations. Over the next few years, Javier became the centerpiece of Cuban athletics. Wherever he competed, he drew crowds. In Europe, where track and field enjoyed immense popularity, he was treated like a star. Journalists marveled at his calm demeanor before jumps, his fluid, almost effortless takeoff, and the way his body seemed to float in slow motion as he arched over the bar. His training was relentless. Guided by coach Jose Godoy and the Cuban system, he fine-tuned every detail. His approach run became smoother, his plant foot stronger, his arch more precise. He studied videos of his jumps, visualizing improvements. And he never lost his hunger. Every bar is a new challenge, he often said. You conquer it once, and then it dares you again. In 1989, Javier defended his reputation at the World Indoor Championships, winning gold and confirming that his record was no fluke. Rivals respected him, but they also feared him. Competing against Sotomayor was like playing chess against a master. You knew he would eventually outmaneuver you. Cuba, meanwhile, embraced him as a national symbol. Posters of his record-breaking leap decorated sports academies. Children were taught about his achievements in school. For a country struggling with economic hardship, Javier represented possibility. The idea that even in isolation, Cuba could produce the best in the world. The 1990s opened with more glory. At the 1990 Central American and Caribbean Games, he jumped 2.40 meters again, proving his dominance. But he had his sights set higher, always higher. The 1992 Olympics in Barcelona were now his ultimate goal. After missing Seoul, this was his chance for redemption, his moment to claim the title of Olympic champion. Leading up to Barcelona, Javier remained nearly unbeatable. He won meet after meet, defeating seasoned athletes and young challengers alike. His consistency was remarkable. While others faltered under pressure, Javier thrived. His secret was simple. He loved to jump. The bar was never a threat to him. It was an invitation. Still, the weight of expectation grew heavier. In Cuba, victory wasn't just personal, it was political. Javier knew that when he stepped onto the Olympic field in Barcelona, he wasn't just representing himself. He was carrying the pride of an island, the hopes of millions, and the watchful eyes of leaders who demanded nothing less than excellence. Yet beneath the pressure, Javier remained grounded. He often returned to Liminar between competitions, visiting family, walking the streets of his youth, and reminding himself of where it all began. To the children who gathered around him, he was a hero, but he never acted like one. He spoke softly, smiled often, and encouraged them to chase their own dreams, whether in sports or elsewhere. By the time 1992 arrived, Javier Sotomayor was at the peak of his powers. He had broken records, won championships, and built a reputation as the greatest high jumper alive. But the world was waiting for one final confirmation. Could he win Olympic gold? Could he prove, under the brightest lights of all, that he was not only the record holder, but also the undisputed champion of his generation? The stage was set. Barcelona awaited. And Javier, the boy from Liminar who once leapt over fences for fun, was ready to leap into history. Early 1990s were a time of change, both for the world and for Cuba. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left the island struggling. Shortages of food, electricity, and basic supplies became part of daily life. Yet even in those hard times, sport remained one of Cuba's proudest exports. Athletes were seen as ambassadors of resilience, proof that the nation could still shine on the global stage. For Javier Sotomayor, now in his early 20s, the pressure to excel had never been greater. He was already the world record holder, already hailed as one of the most gifted high jumpers in history. But there was a void in his career, a missing jewel in the crown. He had not yet competed in the Olympics. The 1988 boycott had robbed him of soul. Now, all eyes turned to Barcelona 1992. Could the boy who had soared higher than anyone else finally claim the one title that eluded him? Olympic champion? Training for Barcelona was grueling. In Havana, under the scorching sun and on worn tracks, Javier honed his craft. His coaches, led by Jose Godoy, obsessed over every detail of his approach, his plant, his arch. They knew the margin for error in high jump was razor thin. A single clipped bar could turn triumph into disaster. Injury was always the lurking shadow. High jumpers placed immense strain on their knees and ankles, and Javier's tall frame made him vulnerable. During a training session in 1991, he felt a sharp pain in his knee. For weeks, he trained through discomfort, hiding the severity from many around him. To admit weakness in Cuba's sporting culture was to invite doubt, and Javier refused to let anything shake his confidence. Despite setbacks, he remained dominant. At the 1990 World Cup in athletics, he cleared 2.36 meters to secure another gold. In 1991, at the World Championships in Tokyo, he once again proved his mettle, earning silver behind Charles Austin of the United States. To Javier, finishing second was both a disappointment and a wake-up call. Austin was strong, explosive, and fearless, a reminder that the path to Olympic gold would not be uncontested. Yet, what set Javier apart was not only his physical gift, but his mental resilience. He had a rare ability to stay calm under pressure, to treat every jump, whether in front of a small Havana crowd or a packed European stadium, the same. The bar doesn't care who's watching, he once said. It only cares if you can go over it. By the time 1992 arrived, Javier was a man transformed. He had matured from a lanky teenager into a focused athlete at the peak of his powers. His frame, now 1.95 meters tall and weighing around 80 kilos, was sculpted for high jump. Long, lean, and powerful, he carried the look of inevitability, the kind of athlete whose very presence intimidated rivals. But Barcelona was unlike any competition he had faced before. The Olympics carried a unique weight. It wasn't just about clearing heights, it was about legacy. Great athletes were remembered for medals, not just records. For Cuba, too, the stakes were high. An Olympic gold in athletics was more than sport. It was politics, pride, and proof of resilience during one of the nation's hardest decades. In the weeks before the Games, Javier trained in near seclusion. The Cuban Federation shielded him from distractions, limiting media access. He spent hours visualizing jumps, rehearsing them in his mind until each detail was etched into his consciousness. His coaches reminded him that mental preparation was as important as physical. The Olympics, Godoy told him, are not won with legs alone. They are won with the heart. Arriving in Barcelona, Javier was greeted with a mix of awe and expectation. He was the favorite, the record holder, the man who had already touched the impossible. Rivals respected him, but they also wanted to dethrone him. The Olympic stage was cruel. It had humbled many champions before him. On the day of the men's high jump final, the stadium buzzed with anticipation. Thousands of fans filled the seats, flags waving, cameras flashing. For Javier, it was surreal. The Olympic rings loomed above the field, a reminder of all he had missed in 1988. Now, at last, he had his chance. The early heights came easily. 2.15 meters, 2.20, 2.25. Javier cleared them all with smooth, effortless grace. Each successful jump built his confidence, each arch of his body drawing cheers from the crowd. His rivals faltered one by one, the pressure of the Olympic stage proving too heavy. As the bar rose to 2.34 meters, the competition grew fierce. Charles Austin, Hollis Conway, and others pushed him, refusing to yield. But Javier was unshaken. His focus narrowed to a single point, the bar. With a powerful run and a perfect takeoff, he cleared 2.34 with ease. The crowd roared. At 2.37 meters, the battle reached its climax. Few could even attempt such a height under Olympic pressure. Javier sprinted, planted, and soared, his body arching like a bow in flight. He cleared the bar cleanly, landing on the mat with a triumphant roar. The gold was his. Cuba erupted in celebration. In Liminar, villagers crowded around televisions and radios, cheering as their hometown hero claimed the nation's first-ever Olympic gold in high jump. For a country battered by hardship, Javier's victory was more than sport, it was hope. Standing atop the podium, draped in the Cuban flag, Javier listened to his national anthem with tears in his eyes. Years of sacrifice, countless hours of training, the pain of missing soul, all of it had led to this moment. He was not only a world record holder now, he was an Olympic champion. But even as he celebrated, Javier knew the journey wasn't over. The record still beckoned. He had leapt 2.44 meters in 1988, but he believed he could go higher, much higher. Barcelona was the summit of Olympic glory, but for Javier Sotomayor, the sky still held greater heights. The sun hung low over Barcelona's Montjuic Stadium on August 7, 1992, casting long shadows across the track. The men's high jump final was about to begin. The crowd of over 60,000 hummed with anticipation, their voices a mixture of languages, flags waving in bursts of color. Among the athletes warming up on the field stood Javier Sotomayor, tall, calm, and composed. To most of the crowd, he was the favorite. To Cuba, watching on radios and flickering TV sets thousands of miles away, he was destiny incarnate. For Javier, this was not just another meet. This was the Olympics, the one stage that had eluded him in 1988. As he jogged lightly, shaking out his long limbs, he felt the weight of expectation settle across his shoulders. The Cuban flag stitched onto his uniform wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol of pride, struggle, and hope. He had trained for this moment, dreamt of it, feared it. Now it was here. The early rounds passed like a dance. The bar was set low, at heights any finalist could clear. One by one, athletes sailed over. The crowd clapped in rhythm, their applause rising each time a jumper succeeded. Javier took his mark at 2.15 meters. His run was smooth, his takeoff effortless, his body arcing high above the bar. Clean. The stadium cheered, and Javier barely flinched. For him, it was just the beginning. At 2.20 meters, the field remained strong. Hollis Conway of the United States, the 1988 silver medalist, cleared easily. Charles Austin, another American, thundered down the runway with explosive energy, his muscles coiled like springs. The competition was fierce, but Javier's jumps looked different, less strained, more graceful. Where others seemed to battle gravity, Javier seemed to borrow its strength, using it to lift himself higher. As the bar rose to 2.29 meters, the tension thickened. Several athletes failed on their first attempts, rattled by the pressure. Javier stepped forward, eyes locked on the bar. His stride lengthened, his plant foot slammed the ground, and he soared. For a heartbeat, his body floated, chest to the sky, legs curling neatly. He cleared it with room to spare. The crowd roared again. Still, Javier remained expressionless. He was in a zone where noise couldn't touch him. At 2.34 meters, the competition began to thin. Misses accumulated. Conway clipped the bar once, then twice, before finally clearing on his third attempt, drawing applause for his grit. Austin battled fiercely but faltered under the pressure. Meanwhile, Javier approached the bar with the same quiet focus. His rhythm was perfect, his jump clean. He landed softly on the mat and sat for a moment, eyes closed, as if listening to some private music only he could hear. By now, only a handful of jumpers remained. The bar was raised to 2.37 meters, a height few had ever cleared on the Olympic stage. Silence fell over the stadium as Javier prepared. He stood at the end of the runway, tall and still. Then he began his approach. Each stride was measured, powerful, accelerating into the plant. He launched himself upward, his body stretching, twisting, arching. The bar trembled beneath him, but stayed firm. He had done it. 2.37 meters. The highest Olympic jump of the Games. The crowd erupted, chanting his name, waving Cuban flags. In Havana, people cheered in the streets. In Liminar, neighbors gathered in living rooms, clapping, shouting, some even crying. Their boy, their Javier, had just soared into history. Conway attempted the same height, but faltered. Others failed to match Javier's perfection. One by one, his rivals fell away until it was clear the Olympic gold belonged to Sotomayor. The moment of victory was strangely quiet for him. Lying on the mat, staring up at the blue Spanish sky, Javier felt a flood of emotions. Relief, joy, vindication. For years of waiting since Seoul, for years of training in heat and hardship, for years of imagining this moment. Now it was real. When he stood on the podium, the gold medal heavy around his neck, the Cuban anthem rang out. Javier held the flag high, his eyes glistening. The cameras captured him smiling, an expression rare for him during competition, but one that lit up his face with genuine pride. For Cuba, the image became iconic. Sotomayor, the world's greatest high jumper, now also an Olympic champion. Later that night, in the quiet of the Olympic Village, Javier sat with his medal in his lap. He thought of his parents back in Liminar, of the dusty fields where he first discovered he could jump higher than the others. He thought of the missed Olympics in Seoul, the injuries, the long training sessions. And then he thought of the future. The gold was his, yes, but he wasn't finished. The world record still called to him. He had cleared 2.44 meters before. He believed he could go higher. Somewhere inside him, he knew his greatest leap had not yet come. Barcelona was a triumph, but it was also a doorway. The sky, he realized, had no limits. The summer of 1993 found Javier Sotomayor in Salamanca, Spain, a city of golden stone buildings, buzzing plazas, and for one unforgettable day, the center of the athletics world. For years, he had chased the limits of human flight, pushing the bar higher and higher until no one else could follow. He already owned the world record at 2.44 meters, set in 1989. But Javier knew he could do more. The whispers had been building. He's going to break it again, fans said. The Cuban isn't finished yet. Coaches, athletes, and journalists arrived in Salamanca with one question burning in their minds. How high could Sotomayor truly go? By then, Javier was at the height of his powers. At 25 years old, his body was a finely tuned machine. His long legs generated explosive force, his tall frame carved through the air, and his technique was flawless. Years of training had honed him into an athlete who seemed born not just to jump, but to redefine what jumping meant. And yet, even for Javier, chasing history was never easy. The difference between 2.44 meters and 2.45 was only a centimeter, but in high jump, a centimeter might as well be a mountain. It was the line between greatness and immortality. The day was warm, the stadium packed with fans eager to see something extraordinary. Javier began his warm-ups with an easy rhythm, clearing the opening heights effortlessly. 2.20 meters, 2.30, 2.35. Each bar fell behind him like stepping stones. His jumps were smooth, graceful, almost casual. The crowd clapped in rhythm with his run-up, their applause swelling each time he landed. At 2.38 meters, most of the field had already fallen away. Only Javier seemed untouched by nerves. He cleared it on his first attempt, landing with a grin that hinted he was only just getting started. The announcer's voice rose with excitement. Sotomayor is ready for more. Then came 2.44 meters, his own world record. Few dared even to attempt it. For Javier, it was a familiar battlefield. He sprinted, planted, and soared. The bar stayed firm. The crowd erupted. He had tied his own record once more, reminding the world that he alone lived at those rarefied heights. But Salamanca hadn't gathered to see him match history. They wanted him to break it. And Javier, feeling the fire in his chest, wanted the same. His coach gave the signal, raised the bar to 2.45 meters. The stadium fell into a hush. Everyone knew what was at stake. The bar, impossibly thin and light, hovered at a height no human had ever cleared. For most, it looked absurd, even mocking. But for Javier, it was a challenge, a dare from the sky itself. He stood at the end of the runway, tall and composed, his eyes locked on the bar. In that moment, the noise of the crowd faded. The world narrowed to a strip of track, a takeoff point, and a bar suspended in the air. He took a deep breath, then began his approach. Each stride was precise, accelerating into a rhythm that felt almost musical. His final step slammed into the ground with power, and then he was airborne. His body rose higher and higher, twisting into the familiar arch of the Fosbury flop. The crowd held its breath. His back passed over the bar, his legs trailing behind. For a split second, the bar wobbled under the threat of contact. Then, silence. The bar stayed still. Javier landed on the mat with a thud, his arms flung wide. The crowd exploded. Fans leapt to their feet, shouting, waving flags, clapping until their hands stung. The announcer's voice cracked with excitement. Dos metros 45, nuevo record del mundo. Javier sat up, a smile spreading across his face, his fist pumping the air. He had done it. 2.45 meters. The highest jump any human being had ever made. For Javier, the moment was surreal. Years of sweat, sacrifice, and struggle, all distilled into a single leap. He stood and raised his arms to the crowd, soaking in the roar of history. Salamanca, forever after, would be remembered as the city where a Cuban had touched the sky. The aftermath was immediate. Newspapers across the world splashed his photograph across front pages. Sotomayor flies higher than ever, one headline read. The man who defies gravity, said another. Television networks replayed the jump over and over, marveling at the seeming impossibility of it. In Cuba, the news was celebrated like a national holiday. Children were told the story in classrooms, families gathered around radios, and for a nation enduring hardship, Sotomayor's leap was a gift of joy and pride. But for Javier himself, the moment was strangely quiet once the noise faded. Back in his hotel that evening, the medal and accolades mattered less than the realization of what he had just done. He had set a record that might never be broken. He had pushed the human body to its absolute limit. And yet, he wondered, was there still more? Could he go even higher? Athletes often live in the space between triumph and longing. Even at the pinnacle, they look up at the next summit. For Javier, 2.45 was not just a number. It was a symbol. It proved that the sky was not a ceiling, but a challenge. In the years to come, no one would match it. Rivals would try, jumping 2.40, 2.41, 2.42, but the record remained untouchable. Decades later, it still stands, the longest-lasting men's high jump record in history. On that summer day in Salamanca, Javier Sotomayor did more than break a record. He redefined what it meant to fly. For every athlete who reaches the pinnacle, the climb is only half the story. The other half is the fight to stay there. After Salamanca 1993, Javier Sotomayor stood on top of the world. He had done what no one else had, leaping 2.45 meters, setting a record that seemed almost untouchable. The man who defied gravity now carried the weight of expectation, not only from the sporting world, but from his homeland, Cuba. In Cuba, Sotomayor was more than an athlete. He was a symbol. The 1990s were a time of hardship. The collapse of the Soviet Union had plunged the island into what became known as the special period. Fuel was scarce, food was rationed, and daily life was marked by uncertainty. In the midst of this struggle, Sotomayor's victories gave Cubans something to celebrate, a reminder that their small nation could still stand tall on the global stage. His jumps weren't just personal triumphs. They were political statements, proof that Cuba could soar despite its hardships. But greatness has a price, and Sotomayor was beginning to pay it. His knees and ankles, battered by years of training and the brutal physics of high jump, began to ache. Each takeoff drove hundreds of pounds of force into his joints, and while his body had carried him further than any other human, it was not indestructible. Still, he pressed on. The world demanded it, and so did his pride. Through the mid-1990s, he continued to dominate competitions, adding world championship titles to his Olympic gold. He became known not just as a record holder, but as the most consistent high jumper in history. His name was always at the top of the results sheet, his presence always commanding. Yet the shadows grew. By 1995, Sotomayor's injuries became impossible to ignore. Torn ligaments, inflamed tendons, and stress fractures haunted him. High jump is cruel in its precision. Miss a fraction of timing, or lose a trace of explosiveness, and the bar wins. Javier fought through pain, often competing while less than fully fit, determined never to disappoint those who believed in him. His competitors saw the toll. Some whispered that the era of Sotomayor was nearing its end. But time and again, he returned. In 1997, he won another world championship. In 1998, he cleared 2.40 meters, a height that only a handful of men in history have ever touched. Even when wounded, he soared higher than the rest. Yet the strain of being not just an athlete, but a national icon, began to weigh on him. In Cuba, athletes often carried not only their own dreams, but the pride of the revolution itself. For Javier, every jump was more than sport. It was politics, identity, and history. Then came the storm that would shake his legacy. In 1999, at the Pan American Games in Winnipeg, Sotomayor tested positive for cocaine. The announcement sent shockwaves through the sporting world. How could the man who had been a model of discipline, the face of Cuban athletics, fall to such a scandal? The International Association of Athletics Federations, IAAF, swiftly suspended him, casting a shadow over everything he had achieved. Sotomayor denied deliberately using the drug. He claimed the test was flawed, or that the substance had been given to him without his knowledge. Many in Cuba stood by him, including Fidel Castro himself, who declared that Javier was a victim of dirty play and foreign manipulation. In the Cuban narrative, Sotomayor was not a cheater but a target, an athlete too good, too symbolic for the world to leave untouched. Outside Cuba, the reaction was harsher. Critics said the scandal tarnished his legacy, proof that even the greatest were not immune to shortcuts or mistakes. For years, the debate raged. Was it an error, a conspiracy, or a moment of human weakness? Regardless of the truth, the suspension cut deeply. For the first time in his career, Sotomayor was forced to step back, To watch competitions he should have dominated unfold without him. The man who had touched the sky now wrestled with the weight of doubt and controversy. Yet Javier was not finished. In 2000, the IAAF reduced his suspension, allowing him to compete in the Sydney Olympics. Though no longer at his physical peak, he fought his way to a silver medal, clearing 2.32 meters. For many, it was a remarkable comeback, proof that even wounded, even scarred by scandal, Sotomayor remained extraordinary. But for Javier himself, it was bittersweet. Silver was an achievement, yes, but it was not gold. And his body was telling him that his time was running out. Years of pain, whispers of scandal, and the endless weight of expectation had taken their toll. By 2001, his career was winding down. Looking back, the 1990s were both the brightest and darkest years of Sotomayor's life. He had set the eternal record, collected medals, and inspired millions. Yet he had also endured injuries, faced accusations that threatened his reputation, and carried the burden of being not just a man, but a symbol of his country's defiance. Sotomayor's story in this era is one of contrasts, triumph and controversy, pride and pain, light and shadow. For every leap that seemed to defy gravity, there was a battle that dragged him back down to earth. And yet, through it all, one truth remained undeniable. No matter what was said, no matter what shadows followed him, Javier Sotomayor was still the man who had flown higher than anyone before or since. When the roar of the crowd faded and the medals were stored away, Javier Sotomayor faced a question that every great athlete must one day answer. What comes after the flight? By the early 2000s, his body had endured all it could. His knees and ankles, worn from decades of impact, refused to bear the brutal demands of world-class high jumping. After the Sydney Olympics in 2000, where he secured a silver medal against all odds, Javier began to accept that his era as a competitor was closing. In 2001, he officially announced his retirement. For fans across the globe, it was the end of an epic. For Cubans, it was a bittersweet farewell. The curtain call for the island's greatest athlete, a man who had carried their flag across the highest stages of sport. But Sotomayor was not one to fade quietly. His legacy was not confined to the bar he had cleared in 1993. He had more to give, this time, not through soaring leaps, but through the wisdom he could pass on. After retirement, Sotomayor took on a new role in Cuban athletics. He became involved with the National Federation, mentoring young high jumpers and advising coaches. His presence alone carried weight. When Javier spoke, athletes listened. He knew the rhythm of competition, the mental battles, the delicate balance between confidence and fear. For many Cuban jumpers, simply training under his watchful eye was an honor. He would remind them of the fundamentals: patience on the approach, rhythm in the stride, explosive power at takeoff, and the unshakable belief that the bar could be cleared. The jump begins in the mind, he often said. If you see yourself over it, your body will follow. Javier was not a coach in the traditional sense. He was a storyteller, a living reminder of what was possible. His athletes learned not just technique, but resilience, the art of carrying pressure, the discipline of daily struggle, and the pride of representing more than oneself. Beyond the track, Sotomayor became an ambassador for Cuban sport. He traveled widely, attending competitions, promoting athletics, and speaking about his experiences. Wherever he went, people remembered not just the record, but the man who embodied grace in motion. In Cuba, he held a revered status. Streets and schools bore his name. His image appeared in murals and posters, alongside other icons of Cuban strength and defiance. While baseball was Cuba's national pastime, Sotomayor had carved a space where athletics, too, became a source of national pride. For the Cuban government, he remained a symbol of resilience, proof that despite economic hardship and political isolation, their athletes could still stand atop the world. His record, untouched year after year, became a metaphor for endurance, a standard that time itself could not surpass. As the years passed, Sotomayor's world record of 2.45 meters grew ever more mythical. High jumpers around the world chased it, some coming close, but none succeeding. The names changed: Stefan Holm, Mutis Essa Barzhim, Bogdan Bondarenko, but the number remained the same. Sports journalists began to speak of it as one of the most unbreakable records in track and field. Like Bob Beeman's long jump in 1968 or Usain Bolt's sprint dominance, Sotomayor's leap seemed almost superhuman, a standard that defined an entire era. For Javier, this endurance was a quiet vindication. No matter the controversies, no matter the criticisms, his place in history was secure. Records are made to be broken, he would say with humility. But some records take longer than others. And his, it seemed, was destined to stand for generations. Javier's involvement with athletics extended beyond Cuba. He became a familiar face at international events, sometimes as a guest of honor, other times as part of development programs for young athletes. He knew what it meant to be a teenager with a dream and little else, and he wanted to give the next generation the opportunities he had seized. In workshops and clinics, he shared not only technique but philosophy. He spoke of sacrifice, discipline, and the importance of self-belief. He told young athletes that greatness was not measured only by medals or records, but by resilience, the ability to get up after failure and keep leaping. Many who met him described him as humble, approachable, even shy. Despite his fame, Javier never carried himself as untouchable. He shook hands, posed for photos, and listened to young athletes' stories with genuine interest. For them, meeting Sotomayor was like touching a piece of history. Outside athletics, Sotomayor lived a quieter life. He married and raised children, enjoying the stability that had often eluded him during his years of competition. He spent time in his hometown, reconnecting with the soil of Liminar, where his journey had begun. Yet he never strayed far from the world of sport. Athletics had given him everything, and in return, he gave it his loyalty. In interviews, he often reflected on how the bar had shaped his life, how every challenge, injury, controversy, triumph, had forged his character. By the 2010s, he was regarded not just as a former champion, but as a statesman of sport. His words carried authority, his story carried inspiration, and his record still carried awe. Today, Javier Sotomayor's legacy is not frozen in 1993, hanging above a bar in Salamanca. It is alive in every jumper who runs down the track, in every athlete who believes the impossible can be done. His influence is not only in the heights he cleared, but in the mindset he left behind. That flight is not only physical, but also spiritual. For Cuba, he remains a national treasure, a man who gave them wings in their hardest years. For athletics, he is an eternal benchmark, the man who touched the ceiling of human possibility. For young athletes, he is proof that greatness is not born. It is built, leap by leap, failure by failure, until the world itself must look up. And so, though Javier Sotomayor no longer competes, his legacy moves forward. Every time a young jumper arcs their back over the bar, they echo his flight. Every time a crowd gasps as the bar trembles but holds, they remember the man who showed them that gravity was not an unbreakable law, but a challenge waiting to be overcome. In this way, Sotomayor's story never truly ends. His career may have closed, but his motion continues, inspired, eternal, airborne. For most of the world, Javier Sotomayor is forever frozen in midair, the long stride, the arching back, the legs flicking high above the bar before gravity reclaims him. But behind the athlete, behind the photographs and the numbers etched into history, was a man of contradictions, both shy and commanding, humble yet fiercely proud, deeply private yet a national symbol. Those who knew him outside the stadium often spoke of his quiet presence. Unlike some athletes who thrived on bravado, Sotomayor was soft-spoken, even reserved. He had little interest in showmanship or theatrics. For him, the drama was in the jump itself, in the bar suspended high above the ground, in the silence before takeoff. Friends described him as thoughtful, someone who preferred listening over speaking. At family gatherings in Liminar, he was not the loudest voice, but the steady one. The cousin who helped with chores, the uncle who entertained children with stories of his travels, the son who always remembered to greet his mother with warmth and respect. Yet, on the track, that quietness transformed. When Javier laced his spikes, when he began his measured approach, a switch flipped. The man who avoided the spotlight off the field became a magnet for it on the runway. It was as if all his reserved energy, all his inner discipline, erupted in those few seconds of flight. Throughout his career, family remained his anchor. His parents never left Liminar, the small town where his story began, and Javier returned often, especially after international competitions. He brought home medals, stories, and gifts, but he also sought something simpler: the grounding presence of the people who had known him before the fame. Later in life, as a husband and father, he found stability in the domestic world that elite competition had so often disrupted. His children became a source of pride deeper than any medal. In interviews, he sometimes admitted that the joy of seeing his son or daughter clear a small bar in playful imitation outweighed the roar of the largest stadiums. "Sport is a part of me," he once said, "but my family is my heart." The discipline that defined his athletic career seeped into every corner of his life. Sotomayor was meticulous about routines, whether it was training, diet, or rest. Even after retirement, he kept to habits built over decades. Early mornings, exercise, careful meals, hours of walking or stretching. But discipline did not mean rigidity. Those close to him often remarked on his balance, the way he allowed himself laughter, music, and food when the occasion called for it. In Cuba, where community and celebration are part of daily life, Javier embraced the rhythms of dance and the gatherings of neighbors. He was not above joining a game of dominoes at a cafe in Liminar or sharing rum with friends on warm Havana nights. What distinguished him was moderation. "You cannot fly if you weigh yourself down," he would joke, not just about physical weight, but about life itself. He sought lightness, in body and spirit. More than once, journalists asked him to explain what it felt like to soar over a bar set higher than any human had ever cleared. His answers were never boastful. Instead, he spoke in almost poetic terms. "Flight," he said, "is freedom. For a moment, you leave the earth. The world below disappears, and there is only you and the bar. It is like touching the sky without wings." To Javier, high jumping was not only about records. It was about defiance, the refusal to accept limits. He believed every human being had a bar in their life, a challenge that seemed impossible, and that success came not from avoiding it, but from running straight toward it, gathering speed and leaping. "Life is a series of approaches," he often explained. "You fail, you adjust, you try again. And when you succeed, you realize the bar can always be raised." This philosophy extended beyond sport. It shaped his views on resilience, on how nations like Cuba persevered despite hardships, on how individuals found strength in adversity. His words carried weight because they were not abstract. They were forged in the crucible of competition, tested by failure, and vindicated by triumph. Being a Cuban sports icon carried burdens. He was often asked to speak on behalf of the nation, to represent ideals larger than himself. In some ways, this conflicted with his private nature. He did not seek politics or publicity, yet his face appeared on posters, and his name was invoked in speeches. Still, he bore the role with dignity. He understood that for many Cubans, especially during the harsh years of the special period, his victories were more than athletic. They were reminders of hope, pride, and international respect. Yet behind the symbol was a man who cherished simple pleasures. Watching the sea crash against the Malecon in Havana, eating mangoes from a neighbor's tree, spending afternoons playing chess with friends. Fame had carried him across the globe, but his heart remained tethered to ordinary joys. Though quiet, Sotomayor had a dry humor. Athletes who trained with him recalled his playful teasing, the way he could deflate tension before a competition with a single remark. Once, When a young jumper nervously confessed fear of missing a height, Javier grinned and said, "Don't worry, gravity is patient. It will wait for you no matter what." The group erupted in laughter, and the nerves eased. This ability to humanize pressure made him beloved not only as a mentor, but as a friend. He never lorded his achievements over others. Instead, he reminded them that even world champions once tripped, stumbled, and fell. In retirement, Sotomayor resisted the temptation to chase fame. He did not seek celebrity endorsements or political power. Instead, he chose to invest in people, coaching, mentoring, and sharing his story. He carried himself not as a distant legend, but as a man who had been blessed with a gift and wanted to pass it on. For him, legacy was not only in the number 2.45, but in the lives he touched. Every time a Cuban child leapt over a makeshift bar in a dusty field, every time an athlete found courage in his words, his story lived on. To distill Javier Sotomayor is to hold two truths at once. He was the world's greatest high jumper, the man who redefined human flight. But he was also a son, a father, a quiet Cuban who valued family, discipline, and laughter. His greatness lay not only in his record, but in his humanity, the ability to soar in the stadium and remain grounded at home. When asked once how he wanted to be remembered, he did not mention medals or heights. Instead, he paused and said, "As someone who did what he loved, who inspired others to believe they could fly, and who never forgot where he came from." And perhaps that is the truest measure of his legacy. Not only the bar set high above the earth, but the humility of the man who cleared it, smiled, and walked back to his family, his friends, his island, still grounded, still Javier. In the summer of 1993, when Javier Sotomayor rose above the bar set at 2.45 meters in Salamanca, Spain, the world gasped. Decades have passed since that leap, and yet the gasp still echoes. The number has remained untouchable, the mark of a man who, for one moment, seemed to transcend gravity itself. But world records, however celebrated, are only numbers on paper if they do not live in memory. Sotomayor's achievement endures because it carries meaning beyond sport. His flight became a metaphor, a reminder that humanity is capable of surpassing limits, of redefining what is possible. Year after year, new jumpers rise. They train with more advanced techniques, with better equipment, with scientific precision unimaginable in Sotomayor's youth. Yet the bar at 2.45 still stands. It has become more than a record. It is a monument. For younger athletes, it is both inspiration and frustration. Some whisper that perhaps it will never be broken, that Sotomayor's leap belongs not only to physics, but to destiny. Others see it as a challenge, a summit awaiting its climber. In either case, the Cuban remains at the center of the conversation. His name is invoked every time a jumper clears 2.40, every time the crowd wonders, is today the day? The fact that the record has endured for so long only deepens its myth. It suggests that what Javier achieved was not just great, but extraordinary, an alignment of talent, training, courage, and moment that may never be repeated. And yet, Javier himself was never obsessed with numbers. He celebrated the record, yes, but he always insisted that his proudest moment was standing on the Olympic podium in Barcelona, hearing the Cuban anthem, seeing his flag rise before the world. To him, medals and victories mattered less than the emotions they carried: pride, joy, unity. Perhaps this is why his legacy feels eternal. It is not locked in statistics, but woven into the collective memory of Cuba and of athletics. The image of his arching body against the sky has become timeless, as much symbol as sport. In schools across Cuba, children still run barefoot across dusty fields, laying down sticks or old pipes to mimic a high jump bar. They throw themselves into the air, laughing, imagining themselves as the next Sotomayor. Some succeed in sport, most do not, but all carry the lesson that flight is possible. Around the world, too, his story resonates. In Europe, Africa, Asia, athletes study his technique, Watch the grainy videos of his world record, marvel at the smoothness of his approach. Coaches use his name as shorthand for excellence. Even those outside athletics know him, the way non-swimmers know Michael Phelps or non-boxers know Muhammad Ali. To inspire across generations, across nations, is perhaps the purest form of immortality. When Sotomayor speaks now, years after retirement, he often returns to one word, vuelo, flight. To him, it is not only about the act of jumping. Flight is a philosophy, a way of approaching life with courage, imagination, and freedom. Every person has a bar, he tells young athletes. Sometimes it is in sport. Sometimes it is in school, or family, or work. It looks impossible. But if you trust yourself, if you run with conviction, if you throw everything into the moment, you can fly over it. This message, born of sport, transcends it. It touches anyone who has faced doubt, fear, or limitation. It is the reason his story continues to be told not only in stadiums, but in classrooms, in homes, in everyday struggles. Historians of athletics often debate, who was the greatest high jumper of all time? The question matters less than the story. For Javier Sotomayor, greatness was never about comparisons, but about the journey, about discovering how high a human could rise. And in that journey, he defied gravity not only with his body, but with his spirit. He rose from a small Cuban town to global acclaim, from the dusty fields of Liminar to the Olympic stage. He rose above injury, controversy, and doubt. Each leap of his career was an act of defiance, an answer to those who said the bar was too high. Even today, when his name is spoken, there is a sense of reverence, not just for what he achieved, but for the way he carried himself, with humility, resilience, and grace. Legends in sport eventually become more than individuals. They become archetypes. Pelé is the joy of football. Jordan is the will of basketball. Bolt is the speed of sprinting. Sotomayor is the flight of the high jump. And flight is eternal. It exists in the dreams of children, in the awe of spectators, in the ambition of athletes yet unborn. The bar at 2.45 meters may one day fall, but even if it does, the image of Javier soaring above it will not. He once said, "I am not the owner of the sky. I only borrowed it for a moment." But in truth, that moment became timeless. His borrowed sky belongs now to all who dream of rising, of overcoming, of flying higher than they ever thought possible. When the stadium lights dimmed, when the cheering faded, Sotomayor returned home. He walked again on the streets of Liminar, sat with neighbors, listened to the laughter of his children. Life went on, simple and human. Yet, above him, the sky remained, the same sky he once seemed to touch. And somewhere in that vast blue expanse lives the eternal flight of Javier Sotomayor, a man, a record, a legend, a reminder that even bound by gravity, the human spirit can soar.